Why don't you come on up, Sergeant, want to have you take your seat, and then we'll bring the jury as soon as they're ready. Everybody may be seated. Just a reminder for the jury before we begin again, if you need something, let us know. Sometimes people's backs are thin. You're welcome to stand if you need to. I just want to make sure everybody's comfortable. Just let us know. Okay. I think we're ready to continue then. Go ahead, Mr. Zachary.
Thank you. If I could get the clerk to switch my computer on to the AV, please. Sergeant,
yes.
Recognize anyone on that shot? 507 videos. Belongs to the right. Recognize anyone there?
Yes, I believe I'm in the lower left portion of the frame, and I believe Lori is in the center portion of the frame. Her head might be extending upwards of the snowbank. Yes.
And you agree that this is on the side of the home that you
Yes, I would agree.
Offer 507 in the video for the purposes used.
Any objection?
All right. So, touching briefly on the 911 call again, it appears that there were points in that call where the dispatcher muted Lori so that she could issue a radio call or page out EMS. Is that correct?
Yes,
And that's normal in the course of a 911 call, right?
it is good.
So in other words, there were portions where Lori continued to talk or cry when the dispatcher was clearly on the radio with you or first responders or the paramedics.
Yes,
All right. Now, Sergeant, would you agree that everyone experiences trauma differently?
I would agree.
There's no right way for a person to react in Ms. Phillips' circumstances.
Overall, you already agreed that they respond differently. Go ahead.
There's no right way to react to trauma for somebody in Ms. Phillips' position, right?
Yeah, people do respond differently.
All right. One of the obligations of officers on scene was to gather evidence in as wide of a net as possible so that you can try and figure out what happened. Is that fair?
If possible, yes.
And one of the questions that you and the other investigators had on scene was how exactly Mr. Phillips ended up injured. Is that fair?
How exactly?
How Mr. Phillips ended up injured and dead.
That would be a question that would be asked.
And initially you were the ranking officer who responded on scene, right?
Yes,
Eventually did investigators respond to scene as well?
they did.
And who was the ranking investigator on scene?
That would be Captain Zimmerman, I believe.
Okay, so you physically saw Captain Zimmerman, and what's Captain Zimmerman's first name for the record?
John Zimmerman.
You saw Captain Zimmerman on scene on February 23rd of 2019.
I don't specifically recall seeing him on scene, but he would have been the ranking investigator on this case.
And you would have taken your directions from Captain Zimmerman or somebody who outranked you on that matter?
Or Investigator Leinfelder, yes, that could be.
Okay. And Investigator Leinfelder eventually arrived on that scene as well, is that correct?
Yes, he did.
All right. So one of the things you and the other officers did was try to collect evidence that could give you some idea of how Mr. Phillips presumably went from upright to prone and deceased, right?
Yes.
And you've noted that there are a number of different possibilities to explain that. Is that correct?
There could be several, yes.
And that's why you took photographs around the scene to try and figure out what could have caused Mr. Phillips to go to the ground. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, I'm going to show you State's Exhibit 36. Claudia, do you recall this photograph later?
Yes, I do.
And what is that a picture of?
It's a picture of the driver's side of the Dodge Ram with the driver's side open. Driver's side door is open.
And publish those text. Take this photo of this dinner or did somebody else?
I do not know.
And I'm assuming that the purpose of this photograph is to depict, at least in part, those steps or the side rail on the side of the truck, right?
I do not know the purpose.
Though there appears to be a running board with some steps installed on the driver's side of the truck. Is that correct?
Yes, they are presented in the photograph.
And this is something that certainly you or any other investigator are going to consider as a possible explanation for how Mr. Phillips could trip or potentially be injured in light of a moving truck. Is that correct?
I'm not sure about that.
They appeared in, did I ask you, did they appear to be aftermarket?
I don't know whether they came with the truck or not.
Okay. Well, it doesn't have a Dodge logo on them. It has HDX at the bottom, right?
Yes.
All right. And those, they appear to jet out at least several inches from the side of the truck. Is that correct?
That would be accurate.
And certainly if the vehicle was moving when somebody was in contact with those, that would be a tripping hazard, right?
Could be, yes.
If you can answer.
Fair?
It could be.
Okay. Was that something that you or other investigators actively discussed at the scene as to whether or not this was consistent with Mr. Phillips coming towards Mr. Phillips coming towards Ms. Phillips at the driver's side?
I don't recall that.
You took pictures of the snow on the driveway as well, correct?
Correct.
And obviously there was fresh snowfall, but did you make any note as to whether or not the driveway was icy or otherwise slippery as a result of the snowfall or the weather?
I did not note that the driveway was icy or slippery. It did not appear to be that way to me when I drove in or when I walked on it.
Do you recall what the driveway was made out of?
That was asphalt material, I believe.
Now, you've acknowledged that you're unaware of whether or not Mr. Phillips tried hanging onto the truck at points. Is that correct?
I do not know that.
You do not know whether or not Mr. Phillips tripped in the process of trying to get to Ms. Phillips at the driver's side door?
I do not know that.
You do not know whether or not Mr. Phillips was dragged for a brief period of time after getting caught on the side of the truck?
No.
And nobody can say with any degree of certainty, investigator, whether or not Ms. Phillips would have been able to see Mr. Phillips at the point that he was injured.
Sustained.
You can't say that, right?
Could you repeat the question again?
You can't say with certainty from your role in this investigation whether Ms. Phillips would have been aware of Mr. Phillips at the point that he was injured.
I could not.
I want to show you a slightly different version. If I can get that marked, please. Dodge Ram.
Okay.
You certainly had a chance to go look at the truck and look for any evidence of damage or indications that it was involved in an accident, correct?
Brief look, yes.
And am I correct in assuming that after examining the truck, there was nothing about this vehicle you saw that was consistent with it being involved in a collision?
That would be correct.
So, I'm showing you Exhibit 5. What is that photograph?
This again is a photograph of the Dodge pickup parked in its position between the house and the man cave.
And I'm going to ask you to hang on to that for a minute because the angle might make this problematic. But you said you've been a police officer for 25 plus years?
Yes.
And all of that time in Wisconsin?
Yes.
So you're more than familiar with that sort of salt scum or film that builds up on the side of our cars when we drive around in the winter, right?
Yes.
And that's something that can give you an indication as to whether or not a person had contact with the side of a vehicle if parts of the salt scum are wiped away in a certain manner. Is that correct?
It could, yes.
And were you photographing this vehicle for the purpose of showing an area where parts of the film appeared to have been wiped away from the side of the truck?
As I testified earlier, I don't recall taking photographs of the vehicle, so I'm not sure why that was done.
Well, I'm going to direct your attention to the photograph there. Can you see some form of that salt film on the side of the paneling of the truck?
Paneling?
The side paneling of the truck. I'll direct your attention towards the rear door by the area where the gas compartment is.
I guess I'm not seeing what you're looking at. If you could point it out to me, but I'm not seeing what you're looking at. I'm not sure if that's a reflection of something that's on the other side, or if that's salt scum or something rubbed off. I can't tell what that is.
Well, one view of that photograph appears to be consistent with something rubbing off in the midst of a salt scum deposit, right?
I don't know that.
You're aware that this vehicle was taken to the Crosse County Sheriff's Department garage afterwards for further examination?
Yes.
And were you present at all for that examination?
No.
Did you view any of those photographs of the truck after the fact?
No.
Any objection? Received? Gentlemen?
So, that's good. I'm pointing the area around the gap here, and you can see that there appears to be some form of a buildup, and then we can see what might be a smear starting at the seam of the bed of the trailer, going downwards, making it towards the rear driver's side tire. Is that correct?
I'm not seeing that. What I'm seeing is more of a reflection. What I'm seeing is you can see, like, from the snowbank opposite, you can see the snowbank. There's a lot of things in that picture, but I'm not necessarily seeing a smear.
You're not seeing something that's consistent with 3 or 4 fingers that may have been visible on the side of that truck?
No, I'm not.
Am I correct in assuming then that investigators on scene did not consider whether that might mark the point where Mr. Phillips fell against the truck?
I don't know that.
All right. The state's going to introduce a number of photographs of the truck, so I'm not going to hash through all of them, but you agree that there was absolutely no damage to the truck consistent with it being involved in an accident?
I did not see any major damage to the truck.
You didn't see any damage at all, right?
Correct, consistent with an accident. I didn't see any damage.
And the glass, the windshield was entirely intact, right?
Yes.
The plastic fixtures for the headlights, turn signals, and fog lamps were completely intact.
Yes.
The front paint job appeared to be intact and not dented or scratched or transferred?
I didn't specifically look at that, but I would say that would be consistent. year after.
The front grille of the vehicle appeared to be totally intact and undamaged.
Correct.
The side view mirrors appeared to be totally intact and undamaged,
Yes.
as did the side-facing windows of the vehicle as well.
Yes.
And we discussed earlier that Mr. Phillips had been bleeding visibly from his face. Is that correct?
From his nose.
Yes. And certainly the presence of blood on the pickup truck would have been something that you would have noted and collected, correct?
Yes.
And you nor any other officer that you're aware of noted the presence of any blood at any point on that pickup truck?
Not that I'm aware of.
You agree that you don't know how the sunglasses ended up at that point of the driveway?
I would agree.
That you don't know whether or not they fell out of the passenger door as Ms. Phillips fled? But
I think that would be unlikely, that they would end up in the center of the driveway if they fell out the door.
well, items bounce, right? And yet,
Typically not to the center of anything, they bounce to the outside. If it falls out of the door, it's going to fall away from the vehicle, not into the center of the
Okay.
driveway.
investigator, you've never been trained in the dynamics of how items fall out of a moving vehicle, right?
I've been involved in cases where items have supposedly fallen out of a moving vehicle.
And you just testified that you have no idea how those sunglasses ended up where they ended up, correct?
That is correct.
At no point in your investigation were you aware of Mr. Phillips wearing sunglasses on February 22nd, 2019.
I'm not aware of that.
And you're unaware when those sunglasses actually were deposited on that driveway. Is that correct?
That would be correct as well.
All right. Now, in cases like this, you were advised that of the possibility that there had been a domestic dispute the night before, correct?
Yes.
And I assume that you've responded to hundreds, if not more, of those types of calls throughout the course of your career, right?
Many times.
And the Sheriff's Department actually has a policy on responding to calls involving domestic abuse, correct?
Yes.
The policy that you're personally familiar with?
I'm familiar with it, yes.
And that policy indicates that domestic abuse calls tend to be some of the most highly dangerous environments that officers can walk into.
Overruled, go ahead.
Correct.
And you agree with that?
Agree with.
That domestic disputes can be very dangerous environments.
Yes.
That's why officers oftentimes coordinate with backup or multiple deputies to these types of calls, right?
Yes.
And it's why you oftentimes respond code 3 or with your lights and sirens on, right?
Yes.
Because the potential for danger is real and immediate.
Depending on the circumstance, yes.
And you investigate serious domestic allegations now in your role as an investigator, is that correct?
Yes, I do.
And you agree that a lot of domestic incidents can look differently from the perspective of the investigator.
I agree.
And people react differently to domestic violence as well, correct?
Yes.
So let's talk about the area where this home was. Would you agree with me that it was in what you might call rural Holmen?
Yes.
And it took you, in this case, approximately 10 minutes from the dispatcher's radio call to respond to the home. Is that correct?
Correct.
And is that approximately a fair response time for the Sheriff's Department and under those conditions at that time?
Yes. The distance traveled, the snow cover, yes, it'd be an approximate time.
At any given time in the evening, approximately how many sheriff's deputies are on duty?
Typically, there's 3 and a supervisor,
Okay.
but that depends.
Sure. And this area where the Phillips home was in, that's within the primary jurisdiction of the Sheriff's Department, right?
It is.
So in other words, unless you call for mutual aid from Holmen or Onalaska, it's the Sheriff's Department's responsibility to respond.
Correct.
And there's no telling how far an officer might be away from that home if a call comes in for help to deal with an ongoing domestic assault.
Yes.
And unless somebody happens to be driving right by the home at the time that the call is made, it could take 5, 10, or more minutes for an officer to respond.
That is correct.
And under those circumstances, the caller or the alleged victim is effectively on their own. Fair?
Yes.
And you testified earlier that you're very familiar with what 911 dispatchers communicate with individuals in these situations, correct?
Yes, I'm familiar with that.
And one of the first things that a 911 operator will tell an individual calling about an ongoing domestic assault is to escape to safety, correct?
Sustain.
You've been placed in communications with alleged victims of ongoing domestic violence, correct?
Could you repeat that again? I'm not sure I understood that.
Sometimes you'll be placed on the phone to somebody who's calling to report an ongoing domestic dispute or an attack, correct?
You're saying I
Yes.
I've never been on the phone with someone who's reporting a domestic incident that's ongoing.
And sometimes you'll be in communication with the dispatcher repeating to you what a victim of an ongoing assault is being advised to do, correct?
Yes.
And one of the outcomes that's commonly suggested is if they can get to safety, to get to safety.
Overruled. Go ahead.
Is that correct?
It could be, yes.
In fact, the preference from your perspective in the Sheriff's Department is that fighting back or using force should be a last case scenario, right?
I'm not quite sure I understand that question. You're talking about a preference. Are you talking about a preference from dispatch or?
Okay. Well, let me back up. As a deputy responding to these calls, certainly your department is not going to give a victim of domestic abuse advice that they need to stay put and accept the abuse because they can't risk their attacker's safety.
I'll sustain on the second aspect, which is it's compounded. Go ahead.
At no point will your department advise a victim of domestic violence that they should simply stay put and accept the attack.
I would agree with that.
And you as a police officer are obviously trained to deal with sudden attacks if you happen to face that in the course of your job, right?
Yes.
You train in that kind of self-defense tactics from the point of your police academy on, right?
Correct.
And it's almost like muscle memory to somebody like you who's been on the force for 25 plus years, right?
It's continual training, yes.
Civilians like Ms. Phillips aren't going to have access to that same type of training, correct?
Overruled.
Generally speaking, a civilian like Ms. Phillips would not be trained to respond to an attack in the same manner that you would.
I don't know that.
You had no reason to believe that Ms. Phillips was armed and able to defend herself with a weapon on February 22nd, is that correct?
On February 22nd?
Yes.
I don't know that.
No evidence to believe that she had a firearm in her possession, right?
I did not hear anything about a firearm.
And the version of events, at least that you got, was that this incident between Mr. and Mrs. Phillips would have happened very quickly.
It sounded as though it happened very quickly.
That's all the questions I have.
Yeah, all right. Ladies and gentlemen, let's take about a 5-minute break so we can get things in order, and again, don't talk about the case, we'll see you back in 5 minutes.